If you want a better writing style, write about things, not ideas. Welcome back to the show. How have you been? I hope you've been doing well, but in any case, we're about to have about as much fun as a group of people can have, because we're talking about writing style and what might be one of the most consequential principles of good style that I can think of. Whether you've heard William Carlos Williams' call for no ideas but in things, spent some time with Strunk and White's charge to use definite, concrete, and specific language, or you've grown up hearing writing teachers chant show, don't tell, well, then you've heard one of the many variations of the idea that writing is better when it appeals to the senses. Sometimes I think we're trained to think about writing in some pretty unhelpful ways. On one hand, we might be taught to think of writing as a transaction of knowledge alone, that what really matters is moving an idea from one person's head to another person's head. With that view, words are just vehicles for ideas, and the less space there is between the words and ideas, the better. On the other hand, concepts, theories, and ideas are seen as being more impressive or more legitimate. Yeah, you could write about daffodils and wheelbarrows and Grecian urns, but why do that when you could write about postmodern representations of agrarian decline, actor network theory, or even pentatic analyses of botanical logarithms as expressed in systemic psychosomatic articulations of the democratization of Mixolydian values in early 20th century discourse communities? Yeah, I did make that one up, but it was full of enough theoretical nonsense words that maybe, even for just a second, you thought I really knew what I was talking about. Bandy about enough jargon with enough confidence, and the sheer weight of all that abstraction will bully people into thinking you're pretty impressive. At least it will at first glance. When you actually dig into that impressive language, you may just realize that it's not saying anything interesting or useful, which is just to say that it's not always a winning strategy. But long story short, when we're writing, we have a choice to make between the concrete and the abstract. And pushing our style to be as concrete as possible can make all the difference. Now, before we get too far into things, let's clarify the terminology. When we're talking about a concrete writing style, we're talking about a style that focuses on observable sensory details. And an abstract writing style focuses on ideas, concepts, or interpretations of experience. So, for example, "It's a beautiful day" is an abstraction. Beautiful is an idea or a concept. It's an interpretation of the day. "The sun rose over the green hills, sparkling in the dew and illuminating the leaves," though, is concrete. These are the observable sensory details that might lead someone to conclude that it is a beautiful day. Beautiful is the interpretation based on the observation of sparkling dew. Abstractions are conceptual, things like beauty, misery, liberty, or, to an extent, words like furniture, stuff, or food. With those bigger conceptual idea words, abstraction is easier to see, but a word like furniture also deals in abstraction because it moves us away from primary sensory experience. Furniture references a category of things, a conceptual grouping rather than a specific observable thing. So you could say that you have furniture in your house, but it would be more concrete to say that you have a wooden chair with a wobbly leg in your house. Furniture isn't a thing so much as a conceptual grouping of things. That is, you wouldn't be walking through town and say, "Oh look, a happiness," because happiness isn't a thing that floats around. It's a concept. But you might say, "Oh look, that kid with the ice cream cone is smiling real big." The kid isn't a concept. The kid is observable. The kid, in other words, is concrete. And of course, we're talking about these as if they were a binary, but as always, it's more spectrum than discrete either or. A thin twig with tiny fragrant leaves is more concrete than a sprig of thyme, which is in turn more concrete than herbs. Also, because concrete language is closer to observation, it tends to be more specific. If you say, "Look, an animal," your friend might say, "What kind?" before they say, "Oh, wow." But let's be clear, abstraction's affinity for generalization is a useful thing. It's good to be able to say that you're going to the furniture store rather than having to say that you're going to the dining room table, end table, coffee table, love seat, sectional nightstand, recliner, beanbag chair, etc. store. And it's good to be able to talk about the concept of academic freedom, for example, or to interpret a situation as dangerous or enjoyable. We'll get into the abstract concrete debate here in just a second, but for now, it's good just to know that concrete language corresponds to things, showing the senses and observations, and that abstract language corresponds to ideas, telling, concepts, and interpretations. Now, if you can't tell already, I'm firmly in the concrete writing is better than abstract writing camp. If you want to make your writing better, work to make it more concrete. Plain and simple. Whether we're talking about Aristotle saying that good style brings things before the eyes, or any of the many variations of show don't tell, or William's declaration that there should be no ideas but in things. Too many writers and theorists have emphasized the value of concrete language for us to just dismiss the idea that a concrete style isn't a better style, generally speaking. But maybe you, like me, might not just be satisfied with conventional wisdom. Sometimes people continue to do things a particular way because it really is the best way to do it. Many times, though, people continue to do things a particular way because they're stuck on an unhelpful tradition. The way we've always done things is not synonymous with the best way to do things. Maybe, like me, you get immediately suspicious when someone's first justification for something is, well, that's how we've always done it here. Luckily, we have some insights into the value of concrete language beyond the weight of tradition. It's not just preferable because it's familiar or traditional, it's preferable because it works better. A more concrete style is a more effective style. Long ago, we talked about why showing works better than telling. My argument then and now is that telling, writing with an abstraction-heavy style, is like making a bare assertion. For example, they are sad is just a claim. You're telling me they're sad. You think they're sad. But why should I believe you? Showing, though, or writing with a more concrete style, like in they sat with drooping heads, wiping the tears that ran in streaks toward their frowns, provides actual evidence for the sadness. It's more believable than the abstract version because it's rooted in evidence. The concrete details show us how we know that they're sad. In fact, in a study published in the newspaper Research Journal, yeah, I know, Tankard and Hendrickson paraphrase S.I. Hayakawa in explaining, writing that involves telling typically involves presenting conclusions, while writing that involves showing presents observed details and allows readers to draw on their own conclusions. They then go on to report on their findings after presenting a series of paired sentences, with each one either being more showy and concrete or more telly and abstract, to readers, and then having those readers rate those sentences. And their study showed that sentences that show rather than tell are, in a statistically significant way, more likely to be perceived by readers as more interesting, engaging, and informative than sentences that merely tell. So the next time you're tempted to write "the local playground is in disrepair," you might take a cue from this study and instead write, "At the local playground, weeds poke through cracked concrete and climb over collapsed, rusted swing sets." Indeed, as the philosopher Jan Zwicky has argued, showing is like offering an elegant proof, one that allows the student to see what is the case. The mind is active, it reaches to understand. When it succeeds, it feels the satisfaction of having grasped meaning. So, adopting a more concrete style that shows rather than tells is an empirically and theoretically sound strategy. Readers are more likely to find a concrete style informative and interesting, and a concrete style is like offering a proof rather than just a conclusion. But Zwicky takes us a little further too when she points out that the ability to understand, to read the signs accurately, has been honed by evolution. Reading in this wide sense is what the mind is for. It is how we survive and how we remain integrated with our environment. When we get it, when we see how things fit, there is a release of psychic tension. This is one definition of pleasure. In other words, a concrete style is more accurate to how we're built. It fits our evolutionary disposition toward the world. You don't climb to the top of the mountain and see beauty. You climb to the top of the mountain and see the valley, the meandering oxbow of the river, the clumps of trees shuffling in the breeze, the sun glinting off the roofs and windows of the buildings in town. Fundamentally, your eyes, ears, and nose take in the sensory data, the concrete facts of the surrounding world, and carry that information to the brain, which then interprets it as beauty. Or, to paraphrase Gerard Hauser's introductory rhetoric textbook, we don't love in general. We love our mother, we love Sam, we love our cat. We have concrete experiences with people or pets that we then interpret as love. Love doesn't exist without someone or something to attach to and grow out of. So leading with an abstraction is like telling someone to love in general, or attempting to get the reader to experience happiness or shame or courage without having the kinds of experiences that would lead to any of those emotions. The idea then is that people don't ever start with abstractions in real life. They start with experiences that become interpreted in abstract terms later. In other words, an abstract style puts things in reverse. It's an attempt to jump the interpretive process we have evolved as humans that begins in sensory experience and then proceeds to abstraction. It's far more effective and far more pleasing, then, to harmonize with human nature by using a concrete style that leads a reader to abstract their own conclusions from the sensory data that you provide. And of course, this isn't from the literature so much as my own experience, but concrete writing is far and away more fun. It's like Orwell says, as soon as certain topics are raised, the concrete melts into the abstract, and no one seems able to think of turns of speech that are not hackneyed. Prose consists less and less of words chosen for the sake of their meaning, and more of phrases tacked together like the sections of a prefabricated henhouse. And it is easy for abstraction to hum along in mindlessness because abstract phrases almost build themselves. Before you know it, you're talking about how places obtain their descriptions as good or bad sites from the affective and embodied experiences that circulate. Default to abstraction, and you give up the writerly fun of observing and contemplating the world and then finding the words that most precisely recreate that experience for the reader. That, dear friends, is the art of writing rather than the bureaucratic chore of writing. And as an aside, phrases tacked together like sections of a prefabricated henhouse might be one of the more prescient descriptions of writing generated by large language models. It's not the hit-or-miss detection software that tells you a student has used AI. It's the concatenation of empty abstractions, the strings of inflated words that don't really say anything at all. But of course, what could a statistical language model, an abstraction itself, do besides generate more abstractions? Well, that might be all well and good, but abstractions are a part of the language, so they must serve an important function. I just got done saying that abstractions offer interpretations of experience, so by saying that we should avoid them, am I saying that we should only provide objective, neutral descriptions of the world and never offer our interpretations of them? Well, Richard Oman raises the same concern, that the injunctions to use detail, be specific, be concrete, push the student writer always toward the language that most nearly reproduces the immediate experience and away from the language that might be used to understand it, transform it, and relate it to everything else. For Oman, abstractions are relational. They tell us how things relate to each other, point out social significances, and give us a way to transcend our solipsistic perceptions. An overly concrete style, he argues, traps us in a world where all we can do is observe the surfaces of things without any way to make sense of the significance of what we're seeing. And that's a fair point to make. Indeed, a purely concrete style would offer only a description of the facts, and that description wouldn't tell us anything about how we could or should feel about them, or about how they relate to other facts or to us. Describe a mugging in fully concrete terms, and you might have readers think that you tacitly approve of muggings. Shouldn't we be horrified by a mugging and seek to describe it accordingly? But at the same time, applying only an abstract label to something without supporting concrete evidence could be just as misleading. What if one person provokes a fight but then reports it later as a mugging? Just as a purely concrete style could be used to obscure the writer's attitude, a purely abstract style could lie about the facts. And Oman isn't making the argument that we should only write in abstractions either. In an early footnote, he points out, obviously, critical inquiry requires both abstraction and details and a fluid exchange between them. I hope not to be taken as merely inverting the values I have criticized and recommending the abstract in general over the concrete. And that's really a better way to think about it. You might notice, for example, that my own style in this video is fairly abstract. So what's that all about? Well, like I said earlier, the abstract concrete thing isn't a binary choice, but a continuum, and you'll need to make choices about how abstract or concrete you're going to be in each situation. For something like a scholarly paper, I'll swing much more toward abstraction. For a poem, more toward the concrete. It's always a balance, and any choice will have its implications. Pure abstraction is really hard to come by. Even philosophers doing their abstract rational thing will regularly propose concrete thought experiments with balls of wax and other things in order to ground their philosophizing in observable phenomena. And similarly, purely concrete writing is also rare. Even William Carlos Williams' famously concrete imagism is sprinkled with abstractions throughout. But I'd still argue that writers should prioritize the concrete because I've observed that a tendency towards the overly abstract is more common among people who are learning to write. If it's an analysis paper, that looks like me writing comments about wanting to see the observable details that support the writer's conclusion. If it's a short story, it looks like me asking the writer to tell the story rather than telling me about the story. And if it's an argument, that might look like me pushing a student not to write the 412,000th paper on the dangers of violent video games as an abstract category, but instead to write a unique argument about banning a specific character or move in competitive Super Smash Bros. Tournaments as a concrete, solvable problem. And Omen is right that we can swing too far towards the concrete too. Second to writing comments that ask for more detail, I spend the most time asking about what's at stake or why things matter, or in other words, asking for some kind of abstract interpretation. But I find the dangers of abstraction to be more pressing, precisely because we can draw abstractions out of concrete experience. Describe being attacked by a bear, and you won't really need to affix an abstract label that it was an unpleasant and dangerous experience. The concrete details should do that work by themselves. But it is a continuum in the end, and we don't have to make the choice between one or the other. So what would happen if we were deliberate about how we showed concrete details to our readers? Friend of the show, Kenneth Burke, says that we could point to a chair in a few different ways. We might say, "Fah, a chair," or "Ho-ho, a chair," for example. In that manner of showing, we're pointed towards an abstract conclusion, whether it's dismissal or, I guess, excitement. So we could combine abstract and concrete writing in something like this. At the top of the mountain, we saw the sun shining over our valley, glittering in the ripples of the river, gleaming from the windows in town, glowing in the leaves of the orchards. It filled me with joy, but my friend found it disappointing. Or we could go for something more concrete, but concrete with some attitudinal filtering like Burke talks about. At the top of the mountain, I drank in the vista. The sun glittered in the ripples of the river, gleamed from the windows in town, glowed in the leaves of the orchards. My friend, heaving thin air into tired lungs and shivering in the alpine dawn, grimaced and said, "That's it?" Or, of course, there's always the power of metaphor. Love is an abstraction, but comparing love to a red, red rose renders that abstraction in concrete terms. It's hard to deal with love because it's a concept, but roses are much more manageable, and the comparison can lead to insights into an otherwise elusive abstraction. Our experience with roses can teach us something about love more effectively than an abstract treatise on love could by itself. And so obviously we need both. But the simple fact remains that most, if not all, of the best stylists show a strong preference for the concrete. And the risk of writing too concretely is both more remote and less severe than the risks of writing too abstractly. So one of the first and most meaningful changes you could make to your writing style is to fill it with the sensory, with showing, with things and experiences and images. In other words, with the concrete and the particular. Adopting a more concrete style will make your writing more interesting, more engaging, more in tune with how human beings move through the world and draw their own conclusions. It will make your writing something to experience rather than just something to skim through. And it will make you a more deliberate and observant writer. Again, in the words of Zwicky, to live by the abstraction of the straight line is to refuse to go outdoors. It is to refuse the joy and the pleasure of insight and the wisdom that Keats calls a friend to man. It denies the heart of intelligence. So spend some time writing more concretely and see what it does for your writing, for your style. I kind of think you'll be amazed at the difference that it makes. And as you head off to get started, I just want to finish by saying thanks. Thanks for watching and for all that you do to support the show and contribute to the channel in positive ways. Happy writing, and I'll see you again next time.